And welcome to Inside Albania with me, Alice Taylor. This week I'm joined by the UK's ambassador to Albania, Nicholas Abbott. We're going to be talking about his impressions of Albania, what his life was like in Kosovo, where he was also previously an ambassador, and the hot topics: migration, return hubs, reforms, elections, and more. Ambassador, welcome to Inside Albania. It's an absolute pleasure to have you in my studio.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, Alice.
Now, I want to start with a question that's been burning in my mind. We were going to do this interview a few weeks back, but you had an invitation from King Charles for an audience with him, which is obviously way more exciting than coming for an interview with me. But I'm dying to know, how was it? Were you nervous? And also, what did he have to say about Albania?
So, as a new ambassador, you automatically, that part of the system is you have an audience with the King. And so that's what I went back for. There were a group of 5 ambassadors, and you each have around 15 minutes with him. Marcel, my wife, was with me, and you sit in, one of the rooms at Buckingham Palace. And he started by asking about Albania straight away. How would I come to be in Albania as ambassador? So a little bit of my own story. But he's very curious about the place. It's not somewhere that he's ever visited. It's not somewhere that's naturally part of our history. Mm-hmm. And so I think he was interested in the place, in what the embassy does. He was interested, to know about the Prime Minister and the elections, because he gets briefed. So, yes, but it's a very easy, relaxed occasion, because I think in our job, as a Crown servant, as part of the diplomatic service, over the time of a career, you will irregularly meet the royal family on and off. And I've certainly met Prince Charles and then King Charles before. We had the pleasure of meeting the Queen when she was in Paris many, many years ago. And of course, there have been others who've been visiting this region or the other countries that I've served in.
So there wasn't any nerves beforehand, like, oh, when do I bow, or do I shake his hand, or what if I say the wrong thing? Or
I think there's always a little nervousness about that, because of course, you're in a new situation. But I think with him, he's somebody, I always say that ambassadors get a lot of practice in doing these things. He gets even more. He's on that kind of on show, but involved with people he doesn't necessarily know, that he's not met before, at a much greater rate than I am.
Yes. Do you think a royal visit to Albania could ever be on the cards?
I would love to believe that it is. I mean, as we were leaving, he said to me, "Oh gosh, I would really like to visit Butrint."
Really?
Because he has an interest in history, and I said to him, "Look, Butrint is not just about the ruins. It's not just about the history. It's also about the natural environment."
Of course.
Because with that lagoon, the area around the ruins, there's still a lot there that needs protecting.
Yeah, and a lot to be discovered as well. I was there 2 weeks ago, and if you sort of go off the path a bit, you see how much is still not excavated and is still to be discovered. But then I learned as well that the lagoon level is rising, and it's critical in the next sort of 25, 30 years. Something needs to be done to protect it all from being submerged.
No, absolutely. And I think, as you know, there's been a lot of British involvement in Butrint previously with the foundation that continues. And I think, a kind of side hobby as I'm a British ambassador here is to take an interest.
Yes.
Because it is something very special. It really is.
Yes, it is. Maybe I can give you a copy of my book, and it could maybe find its way to him and maybe influence him to come. It's got a section about Butrint in it.
Absolutely, why not?
Okay, we'll talk about that. But later, now you mentioned very briefly, you talked to him about your past, and obviously before you were in Albania, you were in Kosovo.
That's right.
And I'm curious to know what differences, because people always ask me about this, they would say, what differences do you notice between Albania and Kosovo in terms of the people, the culture, like living there? And I didn't live there, so I have a different perspective. But from your point of view, how do you compare them? Where are the similarities? Where's the differences for you?
Well, the similarities exist within a language and a culture. and I think the cultural references remain very similar. You know, the names of all those from the real India and the establishment of Albania as a nation echo just as much in Kosovo as they do here. At the same time, you have to acknowledge a very different history post-World War II. And I think there is a real difference between Albania and the former Yugoslavia. And it's there that you see the differences. I think with Kosovo as well, you have to remember, because of the intervention militarily, it creates a different relationship. Mm-hmm. It also has meant 25 years of international investment in Kosovo in a very different way to the way in which Albania has developed. So there are differences. Mm-hmm. And one of the challenges, I think, for me starting here was to not assume that all those things I learned in Kosovo were necessarily relevant in Albania. I'd say after 10 months, I think I've learned the lessons of that. And feel, we were back, funnily enough, we were back in Pristina a couple of weeks ago for a wedding party. And I like going back. It's somewhere I know, it's somewhere I like. But in a sense, that was then, and Albania is now.
It's, for me, every time I go to Kosovo, I feel everything is very familiar, but also different. Like, you can't quite put your finger on it. It just, everything is done slightly differently. The people, they're familiar because the language is basically the same. A lot of the traditions and cultural things are quite similar in lots of ways, but it just feels a bit different.
I'll confess I find the language here a lot easier. This is essentially the Albanian that I learned. And I have to say, sometimes in Kosovo, it was difficult.
Yeah, I was going to say, because they would have probably prepared you with standard Albanian before you went. And then you go there and into Kosovo and you'd be like...
It took a few years for my ear to attune itself. I mean, you can. And people say to me here, well, you've got a bit of a Kosovan accent. I don't think I actually do. I think pronounce certain words a certain way.
I had this conversation with someone in Shqipëri yesterday because they said I speak Albanian with a northern accent. And it's probably because, yes, I spend a lot of time there, and I think I'm around people who don't speak English so much, so I'm using Albanian a lot more, so I pick up the northern accent. But also I explained, I think it's to do with the vowels and the way that we pronounce the A, the O in a much more rounded way, which is similar to Geg and the North, whereas the standard is a bit more nasal.
I think there's truth in that.
And I think that was, they say I sound like I'm from Cooksey,
Oh, really?
And there's this joke, because there's so many people from Cooksey in London. And
yeah. Well, my joke is always that if, in Kosovo it's all bo, 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 and in Albanian it's all s.
Yes. I remember going to Tripoia for the first time, and I'd learnt enough Albanian to be a bit cocky about it. And then I got there and was like... What are these people saying? Away from like the culture and tradition and things like that, what about in terms of governance and democracy and media freedom? How do you see the two countries? Do you see them in a similar sort of place at the moment? Do you see Kosovo as more advanced in some areas? I mean, I know take the EU accession process out of the equation, but how would you compare them in terms of governance?
So that's an interesting thing. I think the EU accession element does play a role. I mean, in Kosovo, again, 25 years of international investment, 25 years of a focus on ensuring that Kosovan political development was as close to the European model as possible. Mm-hmm. I think in some ways has allowed them to create the kind of playing field which feels, in a sense, feels more normal, I think, to a North European. I think Albania still faces some real challenges. At the same time, we've really seen progress. One of the things that I think both in Kosovo and in Albania exists is people sometimes forget just how far they've come. And there's a real, for you and I, maybe less for you, but for me, as very much as an observer, I think what you see is that both countries have come a heck of a long way in the last 20, 25 years. But because of the appetite for change, because of the appetite for improvement, because of the appetite for progress, sometimes people forget how far they've come.
Yes.
And I think this is why, comparisons, like you, I'm sure, which one's better? Is it better in Kosovo or is it better in Albania?
Impossible question to answer.
Each country has real advantages and real positives. The real answer, and this is of course linked to so many other issues, is both countries have huge potential. And I think that is the real issue at the moment, is how to really develop that potential to the best effect. And again, I think that's where EU accession comes in. You know, there are always going to be people who will say to me, well, you know, the UK is outside of the EU, so do you really think it's a good idea? The honest answer is yes, of course it's a good idea.
Yes.
It's what Albanians want.
Yes.
It's what the Albanian government wants. It's what it seems to me all the political parties want.
Yes.
So there is that will there. And therefore, you know, that this is an opportunity for change and for positive, progressive change.
You're completely right. You know, people say, oh, you know, nothing's changed. It's terrible. Nothing's got better. And then I think, I mean, I've been here 8 years and I'm visiting somewhere that I haven't visited for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, or I'm looking at photos I took 8 years ago and the difference is staggering. I mean, overwhelming. Good, but there are things I don't like. Maybe they're building a little bit too much, you know. But even in terms of infrastructure and things like that, my daughter goes to public school now. I probably wouldn't have considered that 8 years ago. You know, there's been a lot of investment in facilities and things like that. The hospital, we have a new hospital now. It's different to how it was. Is it perfect? No. Was it perfect where I lived in Malta for 10 years? Absolutely not. Was it perfect in the UK? Is it now? No, it's not. Every country has its own challenges, and I really do think there's been a huge improvement, but of course there's always room for more of that.
But that's where, you know, to be frank, that's where things like elections are important, because it's important that this is a moment for people to understand and express their opinion about the future they want. And the important thing is to be in a country where a vision exists.
Yes.
And that vision very clearly exists here in Albania.
Yes. I want to ask as well, I mean, you came from Kosovo, but before taking up your post in Albania, did you have any preconceptions about what it might be like to actually live here, to be working here? And was there any specific advice that your predecessor gave you that you can share?
Well, I've known Alistair for over 20 years. You know, both he and I have a past in the Middle East, so we've known each other for a long time. I mean, his advice was really just to take my time and you know, to take the time to understand the differences between Kosovo and here, but also to engage and listen to people, whether that's within my own team in the embassy, but more broadly as well, because I think if there are differences, if you know, preconceptions that I came with, they came from being outside the country. You know, we've talked about the EU accession thing, but what struck me, you know, and I think you come from outside, you go, accession by 2030. Well, I can't really see that. Just don't, you know, how's that going to work? It's very ambitious. But then you come here and you talk to people and you suddenly understand that whatever the kind of bureaucratic or technical challenges in that, the political will and the social will, because I say people want to be there, really does exist. And that if there is a country at the moment that you know, is part of EU enlargement, and it seems to me Albania has the best chance. It really does.
I've also had the case where people have heard, you know, Albania wants to join by 2030, and they're like, oh, you know, and then they come here and they're like, actually, it's a lot better than I thought it might have been. You know, they can see that it's a European city in 2025. It's not some little Balkan backwater, you know. They're very positively surprised. I was recently traveling with a group of journalists from the UK and Italy, and that was their sentiment completely. They were expecting something quite different, but they were surprised, you know, that we had internet coverage everywhere and electric taxis and this sort of thing.
Well, every time we have visitors, you know, friends and family, they're always surprised. This is not what people expect. Again, in part because Albania for so long was unknown. You know, it was almost, you know, an alien place, when it isn't now. And, you know, Tirana, frankly, is a modern Southern European city. And it feels to me as if I'm in Italy or in Greece. And of course, that's in part because of Albania's history. And again, it isn't in a sense, it isn't as linked as the rest of the Balkans to the north or to the east. It's very firmly linked to the west and the south.
Yes.
Italy and Greece are the historic areas for Albania, or for the majority of this coastal area of Albania. And so understandably, the influences are going to be there.
My mum is 81 now, and she travelled around the Balkans, Yugoslavia at the time, in the late 60s, early 70s, in a VW camper van.
Wow.
And she went everywhere, except Albania. Obviously, she couldn't go. And she was in Corfu, and she was at some beach party. I think my mum was a bit wild before she had me. She said she was at some beach bar in Corfu, and she could see a couple of little lights in Saranda, but only a couple at that time. And she asked the barman, what's over there? And he was like, oh, that's Albania. If you go there and you get in, they'll never let you leave, And she was a bit freaked out by it, And she carried this with her up until 2018. I came here in 2017, and I told her, I'm going to Albania, Mum. And she was like, oh, and she felt that sort of fear, like, oh my God, is she going to be okay, And then, well, she lives here now, so.
Yes. So that's a big change.
Yeah.
Well, maybe what the guy said was true. She'll never leave now.
That's true. She'll never leave. Bless her. Okay, let's talk the EPC summit. Now, this was a month or so ago now, but it was the first official visit of a British Prime Minister, which is, I was thinking, is that correct? And then I checked and I was like, wow, has it really taken that long for this to happen? Do you know why it took so long for this to occur?
Well, I mean, I think if you look at it, the UK's history in Albania is really not that long. Certainly, of course, there was the involvement during World War II. But what you saw as well is that period, obviously, of the communist regime, where the UK didn't have relations with Albania. In the 90s, we were very much more focused on the former Yugoslavia, the interventions in Bosnia and in Kosovo. Even during the 90s, for a large part of it, we covered Albania from our embassy in Rome. So it was really only been in the last 20, 25 years that Albania has started to figure, if you like, within our own consciousness, I think. And so, politically, as we know, 3 years ago, things were quite difficult. Things have changed hugely. We're in a very different place now. We have some really very positive cooperation between our different law enforcement agencies, between our domestic ministries. Last year I was hosting the senior official from the Home Office, senior officials from the Ministry of Justice. It's a very different relationship now. And I think building on that, the Prime Minister had obviously been very keen to come, and the EPC was very much the excuse for him to do so.
This is what I was going to ask. If the EPC summit hadn't taken place, do you think he would have visited? It would have been on the cards in the near future?
I think so. I mean, I don't, I would not necessarily have been in May, but it would have been at some time.
And he was excited to come?
Yeah, I think, again, just very interested in what is not a country that's not particularly well known. So I think, as I say, being here for the first time in Tirana, having a good period of time with the Prime Minister to talk about a whole range of different things, an opportunity as well to meet British and Albanian soldiers who are working together, to improve the abilities of the Ukrainian armed forces, was a real special time. And I think that's, what I noticed was very much his enthusiasm to kind of continue to be involved. And obviously we're hosting the Berlin Process Summit in October. But by the end of the 2 days, he was already giving instructions to his team as to what he wanted out of that. So I thought that triggered some good stuff. And I know as well from the team that being here for the European Political Community Summit really helped to set up the UK-European Union Summit on the following Monday. And so obviously there was a whole series of negotiations going on. And being here, being able to see Madame van der Leyen and others really helped. So I think, again, this reinforces the kind of role that Albania is currently playing. We've now seen confirmation that Albania will host the NATO summit in
this
2027.
is huge, isn't it?
Again,
It's
these are big things.
Yeah. And do you think his impression of Albania was more positive than he anticipated? Was he sort of, I guess 2 days is not really enough for the full Albanian experience. But, again, I was with journalists and a lot from all over the world. And they were, again, surprised, happy, curious, loving, even though it was terrible British weather on that day. Everyone kept saying to me, "Oh, you brought the weather with you, didn't you?"
Well, I think it rained more heavily than it does in the UK, but that's a different discussion.
Was there any sort of feeling from him in that respect, on a non-diplomatic level, that he enjoyed being here, that he liked it, that he was surprised, Yes,
I mean, undoubtedly, because, sometimes with these visits, you have the senior government ministers or officials who are still very caught up with what's going on at home. So they'll focus on doing the business while they're in country, and then they'll be on their phones or with their teams. That wasn't the case here. The Prime Minister wanted a bit of time, bit of time to just look around, bit of time to talk about the place, bit of time to go and have a coffee out in the town.
Raki.
No, I don't think he did have some. I made sure he did have some white wine.
Okay.
Albanian white wine.
Good. I was going to say. Now there was a bit of a hiccup at the EPC summit. My phone started going crazy with journalists from the BBC and things asking me about what happened in the press conference. There seemed to be a bit of a blip in communication, perhaps, about what might happen or would not happen with the potential hosting of migrants from the UK, whether that was something that could ever be done in Albania. And Rama was quite firm about it. And then the British media was like, "Oh, Rama, shut him down in public," blah, blah, blah. What went on there?
So the reality is the Prime Minister did not come here expecting Albania to suddenly agree to something. It is simply that, as with other European states at the moment, the UK is looking at different options, essentially for handling those who no longer have a right to remain in the UK. And there are different ways of doing that. And it was one of those occasions where the Prime Minister very much felt he had to address the issue. I mean, as you know, it's a very live issue in the UK. And felt he had to address it, particularly as he was here in the Western Balkans. Now, I think there were those who therefore assumed there was a particular request to Albania. There was not.
No, okay.
There was no particular request. And I think, Prime Minister Rama has not just on that occasion, but previously as well, made his position very clear about this. So I don't think, there's no lack of clarity, or there were no surprises. I think the way in which it played out on a public stage created probably more attention than it needed.
Yes, it was sort of twisted. I declined the interviews in the end because they wanted it there and then, and I hadn't been able to see it, and I just said, no, I don't want to, because I can't imagine that conversation was not had at some point, and then it was just a surprise in public. It doesn't
work like that.
So you touched on the strained relations that used to exist between the UK and Albania, and I mean, I'm talking about 2022 in particular, when there were the number of migrant crossings to the UK, and I mean, it was a pretty difficult time as a journalist as well, because I do correspond for the BBC, so I was constant on the phone, but then all the other media as well, and all they wanted, I had a few arguments as well in the British media, all they wanted to hear was that Albania is a terrible place and it's full of criminals, and they weren't really interested in understanding the nuances of why people want to leave, why they were taking those risks, but also the fact that, the responsibility is not just with Albania in stopping this. There's a whole chain of, events that go on. Things are better now. When I look back to how it was and the war of words between the medias and even officials at the time, it was pretty bad. How have we got to this position now? What are the key of changes?
Unsurprisingly, I would say by some good diplomacy, as you'd expect. And I think, my predecessor, Alistair, should take a lot of credit for it. I think hard time,
great job,
hard work, really not easy, but it shows that you can change these things. It shows that I think through some very open and honest conversations realistic conversations, you can move things into an area of cooperation where both sides see that it's in their interest to work together and to address the situation. We've seen a huge drop in the number of Albanians trying to get to the UK, full stop. We've seen a huge decrease since 2022 in the number of Albanians trying to get there on small boats. That's a very positive thing. That doesn't mean there aren't still people trying to get to the UK illegally, and that's a situation we need to address. But we have in place some very good operational cooperation that I feel it's my job to both promote and protect. And it's allowed us the opportunity to use that as a foundation to widen that relationship. And if I want to do something here over the next 3 years, it's really to build on that and create a broader relationship. That can be around such hard issues as defence and security, which are, of course, very of the moment with the threats that exist in the world. But it's also around culture. And one of the things I would really like us to do is to broaden the kind of culture and soft power relationship. Because as you mentioned, there has been in the UK this perception that the Albanian diaspora are only involved in bad things. And it's just not true. No. That's a minority. I know people, I know Albanians who are living in the UK, who are business people, who are working in healthcare, who are teachers, all of them very much contributing to what the modern UK is about.
Yes.
And that's a very positive thing.
So this week, Prime Minister Ramas, he gave an interview to international media, and it was reported in The Guardian that he'd said some rather unpleasant things about the UK's idea to outsource migrant hubs to other countries. He used some very strong language when condemning the idea, basically. Yet at the same time, Albania has migrants who've come from Italy, who've been sent by Italy. They're kept in Shëngjin and Jadra, and there's lots of reports about the conditions there not being great, And I just wonder what you feel about him sort of attacking the UK, using such strong language, let's not use the word attack, using such strong language in the international media on this topic.
Well, I think, as I said earlier, this is a situation not just for the UK, but for many European states. And there are real domestic pressures around retaining people in the country who don't have a right to be there. It's a political issue, it's an economic issue, and it's something that our Prime Minister and his government want to address. They're not hiding from the issue. They're looking at innovative solutions, looking at ways in which we can manage this. And one of those proposals at the moment is around return hubs. Now, as we know, Prime Minister Ramas has been very clear in his position. We understand that. But that doesn't mean that the situation for us changes. We still need to find a solution to this, and we'll continue to do so.
Along with other European countries as well, who are also considering their options.
Indeed. Indeed.
Now, for the future of the diplomatic relations, particularly during your term, what are your aims? What are the concrete things that you want to develop, projects, ideas? What is your aim for the rest of your mandate?
So I think, as I just mentioned, I think in part it's to try and promote Albania more within the UK, but also change that perception. As we just talked about, many people who visit Albania go away thinking very differently about it. And when I get official visits with delegations, most of them say to me, I want to come back, and I have people planning their holidays. So it's a different, so there's an element of that, making Albania a much more understood country in the UK. But I think also in terms of here in Albania, I also have a role in just getting to know the country more widely. I've visited quite a bit of it now. There are still places to go. And I think, of course, we have a particular relationship with the north of the country. That comes out of the history of the last 3 years. It comes because many of those Albanians who are in the UK come from the northeast. But at the same time, I want to get down to Kosovo. I want to know the coast. All of that is very interesting because Albania is a very diverse country, and I think because of it's still compared to us a young nation, and people are still very very keen that idea of the nation is at the forefront. The flag is at the forefront. I think at the same time, people forget the diversity of the country.
Yes.
And a very diverse history, but also a diverse society. One of its strengths is that diversity itself, and the way in which communities overlap, different identities overlap. And I think that in the modern world, that makes it very interesting.
Like, I was in Shkodra for a couple of days, and we were doing our Giro, our walk around in the evening, and you have the call to prayer, and then you have the church next door, which starts ringing its bells at the same time, and everyone's just relaxed and sitting around. And what you said about diversity, people say to me, "Oh, but you find everything so fascinating here," and I'm like, look, the UK, okay, we have our long history and culture and everything, but we don't have, like, people ask me, what's your traditional costume? And I sort of pull up a picture of a kilt or the Welsh costume.
Or people will think this is my traditional costume.
Yeah. We don't have the same. Like, it's not where you can go to one town and another town and there's a completely different, very ornate, intricate, handmade outfit and dance. Okay, we have Morris dancing and a bit of Maypole dancing, but for me, it's not on a par with the diversity and the richness of the culture, and that's why I find it so fascinating. You can go to one town and then you go to the village next door and it's completely different. There's a whole new set of things to discover. And this is fascinating for me and for visitors as well. But I fear that some of it is, it's at risk of being lost because of demographic change. People are leaving, not just from Albania, but they go to the cities and things, and some of this richness is sort of at risk.
It probably is. The reality of things is that things change, and things change in certain ways. But that's the pleasure of Albania now, because those things are still existing.
Yes, that's why I'm trying to capture them all as much as possible.
I'm also struck that, both here but also in Kosovo, you still have a society where the family is important.
Yes.
And I think sometimes in the UK we've lost that a little bit.
It's that sense of community as well, and I have to say it's safety. It's a different... I remember growing up in the UK, I wasn't allowed out of my mother's sight. I always had to hold her hand. Stranger danger. I made a reel about it recently. I was brought up as a child, you don't accept sweets or money from strangers. If someone approaches you and tries to give them, you scream, help, and run away. And then, I see my daughter being approached by a little Albanian old lady who gives her some sweets or money. You can't scream, and help, and run away from her, It's,
no, not at all.
It's a different culture in that respect. And I think it's really nice. I think my daughter's quite lucky to grow up in that sort of
I would agree with
environment.
I think it is... she's very lucky to be able to do so.
Yes. But I have to ask, it's a typical interview question, but your favourite places in Albania? Because people ask me all the time, and I'm curious.
I think I'm still too new to really...
Far. Favourite place so far?
I mean, so far. So, Gjirokasta fascinates me.
Yeah.
Because it is so unique. I mean, it truly is a city made of stone. And so I've been there, visited twice, stayed there once, and it's it's some distance away, but really enjoyed that. I'm also, like so many diplomats, quite interested in history, and I really enjoy going to some of the kind of Illyrian, Greek, Roman sites. Boulis for me is a very special place.
Yes.
I think of what it must have been like to be living there in the 6th century and looking at the world from those walls. What did that mean to you? What did that say?
Have you been to the tombs of Seltzer in Pogorec?
No.
You have to go there.
Okay.
It's really, and you sit on top of this hill, and they have all the 5 tombs. They say there's up to 100 still buried there, and they have this little area. It's like a mini agora kind of place, and they told me this was like a meeting point. So we were sat there, and you just look out over the countryside, and you have that same feeling, What were they talking about back then? What were they thinking about? What was it like to sit here? Then you really feel like you could be transported back in time. You have to go there. It's amazing.
So Kortra is another one that you mentioned Pogorec. We went to Kortra last November. It was very cold.
Yeah.
But we went to the medieval museum with the icons, which for me is a world quality site, a world quality museum. fascinating.
Yes.
Fascinating to see. And I think that is actually one of the issues too, is that all these different places in Albania have little treasures. You just mentioned one at Pogradec, have little treasures that unless you go there, unless you visit, you may simply not know about.
Yes.
So getting around the country has probably got to be the ambition.
Yes, all your free time, you've got to do it as much as possible.
Free time? An ambassador? Good Lord.
We were in Lin as well, and they have the basilica on top of the hill there, and this mosaic from like the Byzantine era, and it's just uncovered. It's just
Really?
there. There's no fence around it, but it's remarkably intact. I mean, it's huge, beautiful.
Right.
You can touch it. You're not supposed to,
No.
but you could if you wanted to. And just to be so close to something like that is really special.
Now you got me thinking about.
I can write a list.
Archaeological protection is also an issue.
Yes,
that is an issue.
It is
protecting these treasures is important.
Rrëfimi Castle, there's a sign that says don't climb the walls, and then there was a group of Italian tourists climbing on the walls taking pictures, and I was like, do I interfere or not? Can I? And I just sort of stood and glared a bit, but they just it hurts a bit, because I'm like, enjoy the sight and whatever, but stop climbing on these ancient walls,
Well, as Albania goes forward, I'm sure these are things that will be addressed.
Yes, I hope so, because there's a lot of treasures, as you said. Okay, so we'll go from an easier question to a slightly tougher one. I've got you comfortable now. And what do you think are the biggest issues and challenges which are facing Albania at the moment? Society, not government aside, but the society.
So I think it is the issue of transition in so many ways, and at a pace that is challenging. Things change. The environment is changing. The international environment has changed hugely in the last few years. The national environment, the issues around migration, the issues around rural depopulation. These are the economy is a challenge. Let's be honest. The economy is a challenge. The migration issue, not just to the UK but elsewhere, really is an issue for the Western Balkans. So I think Albania, very much, I think, a centre of stability in this region, isn't separate from the region. And so what happens elsewhere in the region matters here. So that's always certainly in the back of my mind. I think also there are just the challenges of modernity, which Albania is now part of. And to be honest, 50 years of poverty, of isolation, still have their effects, still have it seems to me, there is still a trauma there.
Of course. Yeah.
And that's not something that disappears overnight.
I see it in the younger generations as well.
I was surprised by that. I was surprised because I see it among some of my team who you'd have thought were beyond it, but are not. And they say to me, no, these things are still discussed in our families and still play a part in who we are. So that takes time. But we live now in an age where things change quickly. And I don't think, therefore, we should be pessimistic about the future. We often are because difficult things happen. But at the same time, our capacity for change is greater. And that can be very positive. As you said yourself, you're seeing changes in education. It's about changes in opportunity.
Yes.
So Albania is no longer isolated from any of that, all the things that are going on in the world, and they are reflected here as well. But I come back to the issue of potential, and that potential really is there. So I want the UK to be part of that.
Yes. It's potential, but it's also, that I find there are things that I benefit from in Albania, like good weather, personal security, closeness to nature and history, and this quality of life, which I feel kind of outweighs some of the negative or more challenging things, and I wish that I could make everybody see even a little bit of that. Yes, the economy is a problem, and you have to, if you're working here in Albania, you have to accept that you're not going to earn as much as you would do outside. But then I've had to balance it up against, I've had job offers in Brussels, but for me, the quality of life that I would have there, even with a higher salary, is not it's not worth it to me. Those are not just the things that matter.
Absolutely. And I mean, this is one of our core messages to all these young people who are thinking that the pavements really are made of gold in London. They're not.
Yeah, they might really be, but someone would steal it.
Well, or you're going to spend a lot of money just to be there.
Yeah.
And I think that kind of communication is important, helping people to understand that, but also people to recognise the positives that are here. And it's not easy to do always. No. But you know, again, it's a bit warm at the moment. But hey,
for us anyway, as Brits, I still haven't acclimatised completely to it.
I'm not sure. Having spent a long time in the Middle East, I'm not sure you can.
No, it's just in our blood. I want to ask about the elections as well. You were here during the elections, the craziness that goes on before, during, and after. I know you're somewhat limited in what you can say, but what was your general view of how the process sort of played out?
So I think you have to you have to recognise there's been progress. I mean, I think, you know, there's often a desire for the ideal, and I think that, you know, again, that's part of that element within Albanian society that wants to see progress as soon as possible. But elections only, you know, certainly national elections only happen every 4 years.
Yes.
So I think we really did see improvements, and I think, you know, partly because there was a different institutional approach to the elections. I think also, ultimately, having diaspora voting is a positive. Yes. You're getting an opportunity for the diaspora to also play a role. That's also important. I think also you just come away with a very clear message that people do believe in democracy. I mean, I'm not going to get into the details of trying to work out exactly what turnout was.
Yeah.
But I think if you really get into the figures, you know, the national turnout within the territory of Albania is really very high compared with lots of places in Western Europe.
Yes.
So there really is a commitment to this process and to the idea of democracy. How that plays out, of course, is a different issue. And there will always be things that can be improved. That's also, as we said, the same in the UK. We have a big issue at the moment around how identity cards are used within elections. So there are always issues, but that's democracy.
Yes.
You know, democracy is essentially a process of managing representation within society. It's an element of trust between the public, but also with public actors. Political actors. And I think everybody should keep that in mind.
Yes.
Because the element of trust is very important. And it's when you lose that you run into problems.
It's not a perfect process in any country.
No,
I think, you know, it evolves, it changes, it has to adapt to new situations, diaspora voting and digital voting, you know, it's something you're never going to have. I don't think any country is ever going to reach a point where there's a perfect election, you know.
No.
Completely perfect. Nothing went wrong. Everything was as it should be. You know, I don't think that is feasible. Really,
it's good to hold to the ideal.
Yes, it's good to aim for it. But
that's the direction you want to move in. But at the same time, but again, none of these things are fixed. You know, we have the Albanian Parliament has a new opportunity. There are going to be many new MPs.
Yes.
This is an opportunity for them to be actors for change.
Yes.
They're not there to protect a system or the status quo. You know, there's an investment in bringing new people in, and therefore I think there's an opportunity for change.
I want to ask about media freedom. Now, I know Alistair from when I lived in Malta. Before I was working as a journalist there when Daphne Caruana Galizia was murdered. She was my colleague. And then obviously the British Embassy has been very involved with strengthening media freedom in Albania, certainly as long as I've been here. And I'm wondering if this is an area you will continue to focus on, and do you think things are getting better? Or I think things have got better in 8 years, far from perfect, but I do think there are some minor improvements, but the main issue for me is the ownership sort of system, things like this. I think if that's solved, a lot of other issues will then be solved. But is it going to be a priority, and how do you perceive the environment here?
Okay, so this is, you know, you're touching on some of the bigger issues, and again, Albania is a country in political transition. It's a country where the issues of power and who holds power and how power is used are really very important. You know, we've had 1,000 years of practice. You know, we've had, you know, as I like to remind people, we were the first to chop the head off a king before the French did. So issues of power and how power is used is really very important. And what I see here is people bumping up against that change. And actually, again, we just talked about it, the elections are progressing. The way in which power is expressed through elections is improving. The issue can be around ownership of media, and this isn't something that's unique to Albania. Throughout the world, the challenges are that how do you ensure independence? Independence and integrity. And those are two elements that are really very important. You know, in our approach, and you see this sometimes with the BBC, one element is fact-checking. One element is ensuring that the media, whilst they may indulge in gossip, while they may indulge in stories, at the same time there is a real need, particularly around news broadcasting, for fact-checking and for realities. We all know the challenges of social media, where information now is a commodity. And I think there are real risks in it. But as with all these things, what you see over a period of time is that systems adjust. And I think what we'll see in the next few years is systems here adjusting. Because that also, I think, is part of the vision around EU accession. It's something that can press on and push on some of the different changes that we want to see happen. I should also just, you mentioned it, we should talk about the protection of journalists.
Yes.
Because ultimately, this is also where society has to move on from what I sometimes describe as the methods of the past, where people believe that intimidation is the right tool. There needs to be a rule of law. There needs to be people who are, this is followed up by the police, by the authorities. Because journalists shouldn't work in fear. They shouldn't fear for their future. They shouldn't fear for their families. They should be given the opportunity to report as much as possible the truth, but also because it's a reflection of the society they live in. And I think this is a society, particularly with its past, is a society that wants to live in the truth.
It's the issue of protection. I had an incident a few years ago where I had death threats online, and I went to the police and they were like, nothing, he doesn't mean it, blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, but I'm a journalist. And they were like, and I'm like, you don't understand that I'm not just a regular person, not that it should happen to a regular person, but if you are in the spotlight in any way or you're known in any way, it's a lot easier to find someone in real life. It's easier to get information about them, access to them. The threat can be more real when you are in the public arena, when you are working as a journalist. Those threats are often more credible, more harmful. They're more likely to stop you from doing your day-to-day life, than it would do if it was a regular person. And there wasn't that understanding there at that time.
But it isn't just your day-to-day life. It's about the role you're playing in society. And there are people who feel that that's a threat when they shouldn't.
Now, my last question for you. You mentioned a bit earlier, you have colleagues, friends asking you about advice coming to Albania and things. And I want to finish on a positive note. So what advice do you give to people who are coming to Albania or who are interested in coming and have maybe heard bad things sort of in the UK or whatever? What would you say to them? What's your final message for them?
So I'd say it's really easy to come here. There are, I think we're more than 5 flights from London at the moment. So there's easy to do. It's easy to be here. It's value for money. You know, I'm not going to say it's cheap, but it's value for money. It's value for money. It's great for a long weekend. Just watch out with the driving.
That's one thing. In fact, one of the comments I get the most is it safe? You know, so I just make these posts all the time about how safe the country is. You know, I feel safer here than I do in any other place I've lived in. But yeah, the driving, it's put me off wanting to learn. So,
oh, really? Oh,
yeah, I don't have a license, but yeah,
Okay.
I was like, but people keep saying, you know, if you can drive here, you can
drive anywhere.
can drive in anywhere. But I'm not sure if that's a good thing. Ambassador, thank you very much.
My pleasure.
That's all for this week. You can watch Inside Albania every Saturday on Euronews Albania at 4 o'clock, on our YouTube channel, Euronews Albania, and of course, across all major podcasting platforms. Until next time, Mira Pavshim.